August 1914. While Europe descended into the catastrophe of the First World War, a small corner of Africa became an unexpected battleground. German and British colonial forces clashed in the dense jungles and grasslands of Nigeria, in a battle that most history books ignore completely. The Battle of Garin was a forgotten conflict where colonial ambitions, imperial rivalries, and local resistance collided. British forces, including African colonial troops and local militia, faced German forces defending their West African territory. What followed was a brutal campaign fought in unforgiving terrain against an enemy that understood the landscape better than anyone. This is the story of Gurrin, the day the Great War arrived in Nigeria. The context was imperial competition. Germany controlled a West African colony called Togoland and Cameroon. Britain controlled Nigeria and had expanding colonial interests throughout West Africa. When war erupted in Europe in August 1914, the colonial powers immediately understood that Africa would become a secondary theater of conflict. The Germans had military garrisons in their African colonies. The British had military forces and could mobilize local colonial troops. Germany's African colonies were cut off from supply lines to Europe. Britain's navy controlled the Atlantic. The German colonial forces in Africa were isolated, but they were determined to defend their territory. The clash was inevitable. Gurrin was a strategic location in northern Nigeria near the German border. The British commander, recognizing the threat posed by German forces, organized a military expedition to secure the territory. British officers, drawn from the Indian Army and other colonial military services, commanded forces composed primarily of African soldiers recruited from Nigeria and other British colonies. These soldiers wore British military uniforms adapted for tropical climates. They carried rifles manufactured in Britain. They followed British military discipline and organization. But they were fighting in terrain they knew intimately, the grasslands and open areas of northern Nigeria where visibility was good and movement was possible. The German forces defending Gurrin were fewer in number but well positioned. German officers commanded African askaris, soldiers recruited from local populations and trained in German military tactics. These soldiers wore German colonial uniforms, lighter in color than British uniforms, designed for tropical conditions. German forces had prepared defensive positions. They had artillery pieces. They had machine guns. They understood that they were outnumbered and that German supply lines were cut, but they were determined to hold their position as long as possible. German commanders knew reinforcement was impossible. Their mission was to resist, to maintain German control of territory, and to inflict maximum casualties on British forces. The British forces assembled for the campaign included mounted infantry on horses and camels, suited for rapid movement across open terrain. British soldiers rode across grasslands at speed, visible against the horizon. African colonial troops marched in columns, their uniforms creating a distinctive visual impression against the landscape. The force included artillery, small field guns pulled by mules and horses. The force included supply columns carrying ammunition, food, and water. The British were organizing a conventional military campaign using colonial forces and imperial resources. The terrain around Gurrin was semi-arid grassland with scattered trees and rocky outcrops. The landscape provided limited cover but allowed visibility at distance. Villages dotted the area, populated by local Nigerian civilians going about their lives, unaware that colonial war was coming to their homeland. The environment was hot, dusty, and unforgiving. Water sources were critical. The landscape looked utterly different from the muddy trenches of France, but warfare was warfare. Men died from bullets and shells whether they fell in European mud or African dust. As the British forces approached Gurrin, German defenders prepared their resistance. Machine gun positions were sighted to cover approaches. Artillery was positioned on high ground. Ammunition was distributed. German officers briefed their men on the defensive plan. African askari soldiers checked their rifles. They prepared trenches and firing positions. The German commander understood he couldn't win. He could only hold as long as possible and inflict casualties. The stage was set for a colonial clash in Africa while the world's attention was focused on Europe. The British approach was systematic. Reconnaissance cavalry moved ahead, identifying German positions. British artillery began bombarding German defensive positions from distance. Shells screamed across the landscape, exploding against German entrenchments. The bombardment was intense but limited by ammunition supplies. The British couldn't sustain unlimited artillery fire in remote colonial Africa. After the artillery preparation, British forces attacked. Infantry advanced across open ground, moving at speed toward German positions. Rifles cracked repeatedly. Machine gun fire from German positions raked across British advancing soldiers. African colonial soldiers fell, hit by German defensive fire. The battle unfolded across multiple days. Positions changed hands. German forces fell back to more defensible terrain. British forces pushed forward, accepting casualties to advance. Local civilians fled, abandoning villages that became battlegrounds. The landscape became scarred with shell craters and abandoned positions. The fighting was brutal and intimate in ways that European trench warfare was not. Soldiers could see their enemies at distance across open grassland. Bayonet charges happened. Hand-to-hand combat occurred in villages. The colonial conflict was savage and personal. German resistance was fierce but ultimately unsustainable. Ammunition ran low. Reinforcements never arrived. Casualties mounted among German forces. The German commander faced the reality that continued resistance would only result in unnecessary casualties with inevitable defeat. German forces withdrew, retreating deeper into their territory. British forces occupied Garin. The battle was over. Germany had lost control of the territory. British imperial control expanded. But the cost in lives, primarily African lives, was significant. The Battle of Garin was forgotten almost immediately. It happened while the world was focused on the Western Front in France.